Okay, we're going to talk about the British general election, the parliamentary election that was held yesterday. And I'd been following the campaigns for the last couple of months with great anticipation, not because I'm supporting any of these parties, but just out of sheer interest. I want to see where the British public's at. And unfortunately, I have to report to you that the British public is just as hopeless and misguided as the American public. Turnout was fairly high. In the places that I saw, it was above 50%, 60%, 70%, I think, maybe in a couple areas, but mostly in the mid to low 60s. So we're looking at 2/3 of eligible voters coming out, and that shows a high level of engagement with the system. There were a lot of people talking about beforehand that there would be Brexit fatigue and that people are really disgusted with the British political system and that they're losing faith in democracy, and all those things should be happening based on what's been going on over there. But unfortunately, the turnout was quite high. Just to fill you in on the details, if you haven't been paying attention to this, the Conservative Party held elections, I want to say a year or so ago, in order to try to secure a larger majority in Parliament to be able to pass legislation, because their party was hopelessly divided over whether they wanted to implement Brexit or not. So they held an election to try to get more seats, and they ended up, I think, losing seats. They lost just enough to have to form a coalition with the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, which are the conservative group there who want to remain members of the United Kingdom rather than split off. So those people typically support Tory conservative governments, and they did so for another year. But they had to hold new elections because the Parliament was hung. It was still basically completely divided between Leave and Remain. Couldn't get any legislation passed that was pro-Brexit. And then the options to remain in the European Union, none of them were popular enough in the Parliament to actually pass as well. So the can just kept getting kicked down the road over and over and over again until finally everybody agreed to have these elections. Because apparently either the Parliament has to sit for a certain amount of time, or you have to have a certain number of votes in Parliament to agree to elections. So the Labour Party, their popularity was declining in the polls as this process dragged on. And so they finally decided that if they didn't agree to hold elections, that they would continue to lose more seats. So they agreed to the elections, and then they started the countdown, which I think was about 2 months the campaign lasted. And the two more interesting parties in this election were the Lib Dems, the Liberal Democrats, which are an anti-nationalist, globalist, liberal Democratic Party. So their name, the Liberal Democrats, I think actually fits. Unlike most of these parties, their names, their positions have wandered away very far from their name. But in this case, these people are actually liberals, and they're Democrats. It just also happens that they're globalists and anti-nationalists, of course. So they're one of the interesting parties, and they decided that they would go with a completely anti-Brexit, completely pro-Remain stance. And their idea was that if they won, if they got the majority of seats in Parliament, or if they got the prime ministerial position, if they became the agenda setter, they would scrap Brexit completely. They would forget the vote. They would get rid of all the legislation that had been put in place so far, and they would just stay in the European Union. That's where they position themselves. The other interesting party, the one that I was most interested in, is the Brexit Party. And so if you'll remember, Nigel Farage created a party several years ago, probably 10 years ago by this point, called UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, which attracted a lot of nationalists, a lot of right-wingers, but the main goal that he was pushing was just to get Britain out of the European Union. And after the referendum, that project was more or less abandoned, and without the support of him and a bunch of big money people and media people, it degenerated into a right-wing nationalist organization that was kind of like the lesser and more retarded brother of the British National Party, and of course has since faded into obscurity because if you don't have the real hardcore ideology and you don't have the money, you're not going to go anywhere. And so that's what's happened to them. Faded into complete lack of relevance. Now, the Brexit Party was an attempt to redo UKIP, and this time make absolutely sure that no far-right people and no British ethno-nationalists would be able to be influential in the party. And so, what is it then? What is or was the Brexit Party? It was a civic nationalist, free trade grouping. Very interesting. And they went way out of their way to recruit Afro-Caribbeans, British Afro-Caribbeans, Chinese, Indians. The most interesting thing I saw was that in, I want to say, is it Islington, whatever Jeremy Corbyn's seat is in North London, I think, there was a literal Talmudic Jew running against Jeremy Corbyn for the Brexit Party. And his entire platform was, Brexit is good for the Jews, so you need to vote for me over Jeremy Corbyn because Jews will do better off in an independent Britain of 40 to 80 million people. Jews will have more influence in a country of 40 to 80 million people as opposed to the European Union, where there are 3, 4, 500 million people, ever how many it is in the whole European Union and all the add-ons. So that's the kind of party you had with the Brexit Party. The other interesting thing that they did was they moved into the center left on economics by promoting the National Health Service. This was one of their major campaign pieces. They wanted to make sure that the National Health Service was totally nationalized and improved. So they are part of, along with all the other parties in this party system, they're part of the 1950s labor and then later conservative consensus with the big welfare state that came in after Clement Attlee overthrew the arch villain Winston Churchill in the 1950s after the war. People were absolutely sick of the conservatives and all the suffering that they had to go through in the war, and they succumbed to all of these promises about anti-colonialism and technology and massive nationalization of all sectors. So that consensus, at least with the National Health Service, is still in place, and even the Brexit Party, which is a free trade party, right, massively into free trade, but they still want all sorts of nationalization in terms of public services. They also designated the steel industry as something that they wanted to make that a strategic industry and put up tariffs and quotas and try to build that back up. So sort of you're seeing like some echoes of National Socialism or social nationalism there, but it's civic nationalism as opposed to ethno or white British nationalism, and then also the free trade stuff and the multiculturalism. So this was a multicultural party. They promoted themselves as such. The other thing I wanted to talk about with the Brexit Party was their willful and complete subservience to NATO. So I watched one of their talks that they gave, one of their presentations, and this included Anne Wid, I can't remember her name, but you would know her if you're a British person. She was a very well-known British conservative politician who was always promoting, I think, the shipbuilding industry and the British Armed Forces. And so she and several other people gave a talk at one of their campaign stops about the importance of NATO. And it got so bad during that talk that these politicians in Britain, these Brexit Party people, were literally saying that they would serve NATO. They said you can't serve two masters, and we want to serve NATO and not the European Union. So my theory is that the Conservative Party in Britain, which is really not conservative at all, it's actually a center-left party in my opinion, they are the preferred partner for the American deep state and the American establishment. It's not Labor, because Labor, at least under Jeremy Corbyn, is got some Marxist things that they're interested in, and the Conservatives are just totally motivated by protecting their establishment perks, and also making money. And so that makes them the perfect partner for the American deep state. And so if the Brexit Party wanted to try to make overtures to the American deep state and say, look, we can be a very good partner, you don't have to worry about supporting the Conservatives, you can also have us. If we won, we would be just as good, if not better, than the Conservatives. So there were a bunch of very strange comments given in that speech by multiple people about serving NATO, about standing up to Russia, about how Russia and China are the enemies and Britain has to help NATO stop threats from Russia and China. To me, it seems absurd, and you would have to wonder, why would these politicians spend all this time talking about this stuff to constituents who probably don't know or care about this? So the way that I would interpret that is it was actually campaigning in front of the public, but to the American deep state. And you kind of see echoes of that on the interview that Nigel Farage did with Donald Trump on his radio show. So Trump calls in. Nigel Farage is obviously a big friend of Donald Trump, and they have an important political alliance. But during that show, Donald Trump wouldn't say anything bad about Boris Johnson and kept re-emphasizing what a good friend Boris Johnson is to him and how great Boris Johnson is. And so that kind of stuff, I don't think Donald Trump really cares about Boris Johnson. They don't have anything in common. There's nothing there. But this is the important link between the American establishment, the American deep state, and the Conservatives in Britain. And of course, you can go back with that as far as you want into all of the NATO, all of the Atlanticist and Anglo-American links that go back to the 1840s and before, of course. So what else did I want to say? Britain and America are very similar in a lot of ways in their party system. The Conservatives are made up of, basically two groups, I'd say. They've got the free traders and they've got the civic nationalists. And these globalist free trading types, all that they want to be a member of they want to form the world into one trading bloc. And that's really all they care about, because there's more money in that for them than anything else. And it's very similar to America, in which you have the Republican Party with the so-called right wing, or, the hard right part of the Republican Party that's just civic nationalists. And the Conservatives in Britain and the Republicans in America, neither of them want to take any action on immigration. They want they want to bring in hundreds of thousands, in the case of Britain, or over 1 million people legally in the United States into the country every year. And there's the Conservatives, for 3 or 4 elections running, had things in their party manifesto about reducing legal immigration, and every time they won, they would never implement any of it. And so this time they finally just left it out entirely, because they don't care anymore. There's no point in even talking to the public about it, because no one believes that it's going to happen. The Brexit Party, by contrast, was saying they would limit new immigration to Britain to 5,000 people a year, legal immigration. And the Labour Party, we'll talk briefly about them. There's 3 factions in the Labour Party. There's the old school economic Marxists like Jeremy Corbyn. They're mostly on the outs. In America, they don't even exist in the Democratic Party. They're subsumed into the other 2 factions. And the other 2 factions, one of them is also neoliberal. It's the Blairites in Britain and the people like Hillary Clinton in the United States. And that's the establishment wing of both parties. A little bit weaker today in Britain, I think, because of the Iraq War issues and how unpopular that was. And the activist wing of both the Labor Party and the Democratic Party in America, it's the cultural Marxists. So our good friends, who believe that you should have to worship non-whites and homosexuals as the ultimate paragon of virtue, that it is virtuous simply to be born non-white, and that it's virtuous to be a sodomite. That's what those people believe. And so they are doing, I think, most of the heavy lifting, both in the Democratic Party and in the Labor Party. Now, Labor was totally crushed in this election, lost, I think you can see here for Gay and for Labor, they lost 42 seats. And the reason why they lost 42 seats is because they had issues with so-called anti-Semitism. So the Jewish money backed out of the Labor Party and moved into the Conservative Party, because Jeremy Corbyn, the leader, is pro-Palestinian, unapologetically so. And, the Jews in Britain just can't have that, just can't do it, doesn't work. Nationalism for the Israelis and no nationalism for the British, obviously, is the standard deal. So they got crushed with regards to that. Their money went away. But I think the final thing that I'll mention is just the way that the tenor of the campaign was that I heard. The conservatives and all the working class British white people were told and were saying, you can't let Jeremy Corbyn get in because he's a Marxist and he will ruin the country. Everybody will go to gulag camps and everything will be nationalized and there won't be any food on the shelves in the supermarket and all this kind of stuff. So these people vote for the Conservative Party, which does not represent them, does not have their interests at heart, is a center-left party, and is going to continue to import people who are going to make life difficult for the British public. They have two big issues over there related to immigration. One is public services, and the other is housing. There is not enough housing in Britain for the people who live there right now, and therefore they are losing every year by continuing to import more and more people. There's just nowhere for them to live. It's a small island and it's overpopulated and there's not enough housing stock. The other thing is the NHS. Since it's nationalized and the market can't really catch up to medical problems, they have to wait for the government to deal with it. If you have an illness in Britain, you've got to go sign up and you got to wait to be seen. And sometimes these people are waiting months, and then when they finally get there, the hospitals are filthy and the services aren't any good. So the issue is that when you continue to import all these people, thousands of people a year, you might get one doctor out of 1,000 immigrants. But that doctor is going to have to help take care of all these other 999 immigrants who've just come into the country. And then there are also EU nationals, like Polish men who come over and work in the British construction industry for 3 to 5 months out of the year and then go back home to Poland. And while they're there, they're going to take advantage of the public services, but they're not a permanent population, so they're not going to be rendering long-time professional services. So there's a lot of issues related to EU membership and the immigration concerns there, and the legal and illegal immigration, of course, that just make this a complete loss for the British public. And the Conservative Party doesn't want to do a damn thing about it. They've got no interest, they've got no motivation. They're not going to fix these issues. But the British public delivered this landslide victory for the Conservative Party just because of scary Jeremy Corbyn's scary Marxism. And this is exactly what happens in the United States, although the threat, I think, is a bit more real there. Because white people have now shrunk to be, anywhere between 60 and 50% of America, whereas in Britain they're still the overwhelming majority of the public and the voting public. In America, I can't hardly make headway with people about trying to get them to do something other than vote for the Republican Party. They just can't do it, and it's because they're terrified of the Democrats. And so something like the Brexit Party would have been, I think, marginally better than the Conservatives, even though at the end of the day the Brexit Party was still fundamentally an unsound idea and an unsound group of people. Civic nationalism is better than just outright neoliberal free trading elitism, which is what the Conservative Party represents, just pure oligarchy. The Brexit Party would have been a step in the right direction, but the British public were so terrified of Jeremy Corbyn's Marxism that they chose to vote for the greater of the two evils in that case, the Conservative Party over the Brexit Party. The last thing I guess I'll say is that, in a way, the Brexit Party really represents rolling back the gains to the 1950s, the gains of the left back to the 1950s. And if you are a LaRouche type, or if you follow any of the Webster Tarpley type criticisms, or many other people too, then even if you voted for the Brexit Party, even if you supported them with their center-left kind of populist agenda that they had, all you're doing is returning us to the Britain of the 1950s, and that's the lineal descendant of the Britain of the 19-teens and 30s that essentially ruined Europe and the West forever. So I think that the reason why the Brexit Party was able to compete on a national scale and get publicity is because, at the end, if they had succeeded, they just would have put the London banks back in charge of the British economy. So it would be a move away from European integration, away from the EU, back to Anglo-American Atlanticism. So you really, if you look at it on the issue-by-issue scale, they may be better on some issues, but in the big picture, it's Atlanticism. It's the same old stuff from the 20th century. What did I do here? I put together a list of Leave and Remain MPs that were elected. These aren't the final election results, by the way. These are just the ones I looked at last night before I went to sleep. So I said if 2/3 of the Conservative Party want to leave and 1/3 want to remain, and if we split the Labour Party in half, the number of seats that they won. I'm sorry, this is also proportional to the number of votes they got. This is not about the actual number of seats won, but this is proportional voting, saying, for instance, if this was like a PR system. So I wanted to kind of get an idea about what the public would have gotten if they voted for these parties based on what they were standing for. The SNP and the Lib Dems. The Lib Dems got robbed, in terms of the number of votes they got. The Lib Dems are coming away with like 8 to 10 votes, or 8 to 10 seats rather, in Parliament, even though they got 3.5 million votes. If it was a PR system, they would have gotten 74 seats. They actually got 10. So pretty big imbalances there, and that's why a lot of people would want a PR system. So let's see here. If we gave 2/3 of the Conservative Party to the Leave side and 1/3 to the Remain side, if we split the Labour Party 50-50, and we could argue about that a lot, but that's just because it's totally schizophrenic in how they treat it. The SNP and the Lib Dems both want to remain for sure. That's probably the Greens or something. I don't know who that was. Who's this? Greens would have gotten 18. The Welsh National Party would have gotten 3. And then the Brexit Party would have gotten 13. So just the way that I cooked it up here, it would look to me like a majority of the British public, a slight majority, voted probably to remain. But yeah, if you messed with these numbers a little bit, you could easily come out with it being 50-50 or a majority voting to leave. I think 70% of the British public of the Labour Party constituencies voted to leave, something like that, maybe 60 to 70%. So if we did multiply that by 3/4, and then 210 minus 158. Yeah, so if we did that, if we cooked it up that way differently, then you would have a fairly large overwhelming majority for the British people voting for Leave parties. But the campaigns are just the campaigns are all run for exactly for the electoral system that we were looking at. So the Brexit Party, for instance, which we've got down here for 13, didn't run in any conservative constituencies. And so if they had done that, then, they would have proportionally gotten much more than 13 votes, if we were just in this PR example. But anyhow, these are the issues that that I've been thinking about. And like I said, I followed this election fairly closely. Haven't published anything on it or made any videos or anything because of the natalism issue like I brought up in the other one I made. But those are my thoughts, and if anybody out there is British, Australian, or Canadian, I'd like to hear your thoughts about it, because I'm sure you've got exactly the same issues in the Anglosphere worldwide. Okay, thank you for your time.